Давай предположим, что все случилось, Царукян с Топурией дерутся. Ты кого видишь фаворитом в этом бою?
Я не вижу шансов у Топури.
То есть ты считаешь, что
Я
Арман
на ударке
да?
тоже не даю. Арман слишком дистанционно дерется. Я, например, 80-20 я вижу победителем Армана. Я считаю, что его борьба, его прессинг, его говорить, это тоже надо.
When the Indiana Fever made headlines for bringing in Amber Cox as their new general manager, many assumed the story would be about stability, structure, and safe decision-making. But what unfolded instead was something far more shocking. Cox didn't come in to play it safe. She came in to tear down old patterns and rebuild the franchise in a way that would make the rest of the league take notice. From the very beginning, she made moves that forced people to raise their eyebrows. One of those was letting Tammy Bentley walk into the expansion draft, a decision many analysts labeled as reckless. But Cox wasn't reckless. She was calculated. She knew what she was doing. Every step seemed like it was crafted not just to shape the roster, but to shake the entire foundation of how people viewed the Fever. The WNBA community suddenly realized this wasn't the same Indiana team they'd been dismissing for years. This was a team about to carve out an entirely new identity, one bold move at a time.
Давай предположим, что все случилось, Царукян с Топурией дерутся. Ты кого видишь фаворитом в этом бою?
Я не вижу шансов у Топури.
То есть ты считаешь, что
Я
Арман
на ударке
да?
тоже не даю. Арман слишком дистанционно дерется. С ударниками держит дистанцию хорошо, ногами лучше работает. И сейчас уже Арман слишком хорошо. У него есть материал, который он может посмотреть и хорошо изучить. Если 3 боя назад, если он сыгрался, может, он не так опасался. Но сейчас уже видно то, чего можно опасаться от Топури. Я считаю, что в данный момент лучший боец в легком весе это Топури.
Ты про Царукян?
Да, я про Царукян.
The reaction to Cox's early decisions was explosive. Fans who had waited years for a competitive Fever roster were divided. Some believed these bold calls were the only way forward, a necessary storm before the calm. Others were furious, claiming she had just sabotaged the future by letting go of talent too easily. But here's where the drama really took hold. Behind the noise, behind the heated takes, something else was happening. Cox's vision wasn't about short-term applause, it was about long-term dominance. She wasn't trying to win the news cycle, she was trying to build a dynasty. And that's exactly what people didn't see at first. By making moves that seemed outrageous in the moment, she forced everyone, fans, rivals, even her own players, to question what Indiana Fever basketball was supposed to look like. That kind of disruption doesn't just fade away. It creates pressure, it creates headlines, and more importantly, it creates curiosity. The question now wasn't, what did the Fever lose? The real question was, what do they know that we don't? And that question started to change everything.
Выиграет он при этом за счет борьбы, правильно?
За счет ММА стиля.
Но
это не вольная борьба.
Но будет проходить, да?
Арман может повалить, у него хорошие локти в партере. Очень хороший локти. Может бороться, разбаривать, спину забирать.
А вот в эту опасную дистанцию с Топурией просто не зайдет.
Не зайдет, слишком уже есть бои, он уже может посмотреть, изучить. Я например, 80-20 я вижу победителем Армана. Я считаю, что его борьба, его прессинг, его говорить, это тоже надо учитывать. Он выше него почти на 10 сантиметров, если не ошибаюсь. И он больше него весом.
By the time the Fever hit the court under Cox's vision, the energy was undeniable. This wasn't a roster built to quietly participate. This was a roster designed to demand attention. Every possession, every substitution, every headline carried weight. And at the center of it all was the question that kept fans glued to the screen. Was Amber Cox really a genius playing chess while everyone else played checkers? Or was she setting Indiana up for disaster? That tension, hope colliding with fear, was the exact fuel the Fever needed. Suddenly, games weren't just about scores, they were about statements. Could Indiana really compete with the best? Could they actually transform into the powerhouse Cox envisioned? Each night became an episode in a larger story, one that fans couldn't afford to miss. And that's why if you're watching this, you're already part of the journey. Because the Fever's rise or fall won't just belong to the players on the court, it'll belong to every fan who dared to follow them through the chaos. So if you haven't yet, make sure you subscribe because this story is only getting started. And trust me, you'll want to see what happens next.
И, конечно, борьба, она всегда рулила. Да, особенно когда такие бои бывают. Ну, мы знаем, какая борьба у Холлоуэя и какая борьба у последнего Чарльза Оливера. У них ее практически нет. Они ударники. Они пошли на рожон и хапнули свое. А человек, который взял ногу, поборолся, взял корпус, поборолся.
Ну да, то, что
с такими он не дрался, он дрался со всеми ударниками. Волконовский не борется, другие не борются, но с кем он дрался? Просто назови хоть одного, хоть чуть-чуть, хоть, даже не 50%, который хоть 20%.
Intro 3. The WNBA has always been a league of narratives. Teams rising, dynasties falling, players carving their names into the fabric of basketball history. But few stories have carried the raw weight, controversy, and anticipation that now surrounds the Indiana Fever under Amber Cox's regime. This isn't just about a team trying to win games. This is about a franchise trying to change its destiny, a franchise attempting to rewrite its reputation, and in the process, a general manager who has become both the most polarizing and the most fascinating figure in the league. At first, people underestimated her. Amber Cox walked into Indiana and immediately had to face the ghosts of failure. For years, the Fever had been painted as the underdogs who never quite figured it out. The franchise had moments, flashes of potential, even playoff runs, but there was no sustained dominance. To many fans, the Fever had become an afterthought, a team you circled on the schedule as an easy win. Cox didn't just want to change that perception, she wanted to obliterate it. And the way she went about it left everyone stunned. When she let Tammy Bentley go in the expansion draft, the headlines were merciless. Analysts wrote columns calling it a disaster waiting to happen. Former players questioned if Cox even understood what she had walked into. Fans took to social media, some defending her vision, others demanding her immediate resignation. But here's the part most people didn't see. Cox wasn't reacting to the noise. She was orchestrating it. Every controversial move, every unexpected cut, every eyebrow-raising trade, those weren't mistakes. They were signals. Signals that Indiana Fever basketball was no longer business as usual. And it wasn't just about roster construction. Cox knew that perception in the WNBA carries as much weight as performance. The league thrives on narratives, rivalries, and larger-than-life storylines. By making moves that forced people to argue, she made sure Indiana was always in the conversation. Suddenly, a team that had spent years being ignored was dominating the sports shows, trending online, and drawing headlines that even powerhouse franchises couldn't match. It was chaos, yes, but it was calculated chaos. But here's where things get even more fascinating. For all the noise around her decisions, Cox wasn't building a team to win in one season. She was playing the long game. She knew the Fever couldn't become champions overnight. What they could become, however, was a franchise that everyone feared playing. A team that disrupted the comfort zones of opponents. A team that played with a chip so heavy on its shoulder that it forced the rest of the league to adjust. That mindset filtered straight into the locker room. Players began to feel it. Practices weren't just about drills anymore. They were about proving something to themselves, to the league, to every critic waiting to watch them fail. Every game carried a weight that went beyond the scoreboard. The Fever weren't just fighting for wins. They were fighting to validate their existence. That kind of hunger doesn't fade. It grows, it spreads, and it changes everything. The media, of course, kept spinning their narratives. One week, Cox was a genius for signing overlooked talent who suddenly erupted on the court. The next week, she was labeled a reckless gambler when one of her high-risk decisions didn't pan out. But here's the thing, Cox didn't care about winning the media cycle. She cared about creating an identity that could withstand any storm. That's why, even when Indiana stumbled early, she never flinched. Her message was simple. Stick with the plan, and the results will come. And slowly they did. The Fever began to find their rhythm. They started winning games they had no business winning. They started challenging teams that had dominated them for years. Opponents who once viewed Indiana as an easy night suddenly realized they were in for a fight every time they stepped on the court. And that's when the narrative started to shift. The critics who once mocked Cox began asking the question nobody saw coming. What if she's actually right? But the story doesn't end there, because while the Fever were finding their footing, another storyline was beginning to brew. Rivalries. Every great WNBA rise comes with its share of enemies, and the Fever's new identity guaranteed that battles were inevitable. Teams that once ignored Indiana now circled the matchup as a test of pride. Players who dismissed them now felt the need to make statements whenever they shared the floor. And with every clash, the drama only grew louder. That's the thing about transformation. It doesn't happen quietly. It doesn't happen smoothly. It happens in storms, in battles, in moments that force everyone to pick a side. Amber Cox knew this from the start. And she was willing to take the heat, willing to play the villain, if it meant Indiana Fever basketball would never again be ignored. So where does that leave us now? Right in the middle of a story still unfolding. A story where every decision, every game, every headline is another chapter in a larger saga. And the most compelling part? We still don't know if Cox's gamble will pay off in the end. But what we do know is this. For the first time in years, everyone is watching. Rivalries are the fuel of any league, and in the WNBA, they are the difference between just another game and a must-watch spectacle. The Indiana Fever, under Amber Cox, were no longer just a team trying to rebuild. They were a team forcing rivalries into existence. It started subtly. A hard foul here, a heated exchange there, moments that would have once gone unnoticed. But when the Fever began to claw out unexpected wins, those little sparks ignited into something bigger. Suddenly, Indiana wasn't just a nuisance. They were a threat. And threats don't get ignored, they get targeted. One of the first battles that turned heads came against the Chicago Sky. For years, the Sky had treated the Fever like a younger sibling trying to punch above its weight. But this time, Indiana didn't back down. They fought for every possession, they celebrated every bucket like it was the finals, and they forced Chicago into a dogfight. By the end, even though the Fever fell short, the message was clear. The days of rolling over Indiana were done. Then came the clash with the New York Liberty, a team stacked with superstars, a team many predicted would steamroll their way to dominance. On paper, Indiana had no chance. But on the court, they played like their lives depended on it. The Fever didn't just compete, they forced New York into overtime. Cameras caught Liberty players shaking their heads in frustration, and analysts who had dismissed Indiana suddenly found themselves revising their takes live on air. That game didn't just shift the conversation, it cemented Indiana's new identity as disruptors. And while the league was starting to take notice, inside the Fever's locker room, something deeper was happening. Players began to believe in themselves in a way they hadn't before. The underdog mentality fused with Cox's relentless push for identity, creating a team culture that thrived on being doubted. Every slight, every negative headline, every dismissive comment from an opponent was turned into fuel. And with each passing week, the Fever grew hungrier. This culture shift wasn't accidental. Cox had designed it. From the beginning, she understood that Indiana didn't have the resources or the reputation to lure every superstar. What they did have was the ability to create an atmosphere where overlooked players could thrive, where grit mattered as much as talent, and where being underestimated was a weapon rather than a weakness. That's why her roster decisions made sense when viewed through this lens. Players who other teams had written off found new life in Indiana. Journeymen became starters. Rookies were thrown into the fire and responded with fearless energy. The Fever weren't just building a team, they were building believers. And nothing is more dangerous in sports than a group of players who believe they have nothing to lose. The league, of course, kept spinning its narratives. One week, Indiana was the Cinderella story. The next, they were the villains for playing too physically or celebrating too loudly. But Cox didn't flinch. She wanted the Fever to live in that tension, to embrace being misunderstood. Because when the world can't decide whether to love you or hate you, one thing is certain. They can't ignore you. And that was the entire point. As rivalries intensified, so did the scrutiny. Opponents accused Indiana of being reckless, of crossing lines, of playing with a level of aggression that bordered on dangerous. Headlines painted them as the league's troublemakers. But behind the scenes, Cox and her coaching staff leaned into that image. They told the players, if they're calling you reckless, it means they're scared. If they're calling you dirty, it means you've gotten under their skin. Keep going. That mindset carried over into every game. The Fever became known for their relentless energy, their refusal to quit, and their ability to make even the most dominant teams uncomfortable. They weren't perfect, far from it, but they were unforgettable. And in the WNBA, where attention is currency, unforgettable is priceless. But here's where the real genius of Cox's strategy comes into play. While everyone was focused on the nightly battles, she was building towards something bigger. She understood that the WNBA thrives on stars, players who transcend the court, who draw crowds, who create headlines. And she knew Indiana needed one. Not just a good player, but a face of the franchise. A figure who could embody everything the Fever stood for and turn the team's scrappy reputation into a brand. That's why every move she made, every risk she took, wasn't just about winning games. It was about setting the stage for that star to emerge. And while the media speculated endlessly about who that might be, Cox stayed silent. She let the noise swirl, let the debates rage, while behind closed doors, she worked the chessboard. Because to her, this wasn't about luck. It was about timing. And timing, as any great strategist knows, can change everything. Meanwhile, fans who had once abandoned the Fever began to return. Attendance ticked upward. Merchandise sales grew. Social media buzzed with debates about Indiana's rise. And with every new headline, every highlight clip that went viral, the Fever transformed a little more from laughingstock to lightning rod. The journey was far from complete. Losses still stung. Mistakes still haunted them. But for the first time in years, Indiana Fever basketball mattered. And in the WNBA, that's half the battle. The other half, turning relevance into dominance. And that's the part Cox has been preparing for all along. Because while everyone else debates the here and now, she's already thinking 3 steps ahead. Amber Cox's master plan wasn't just about reshaping the Fever's present. It was about securing a future where Indiana wouldn't just be relevant for a season or 2. They would be a lasting force, a franchise that commanded respect year after year. That kind of vision requires more than guts. It requires patience, foresight, and a willingness to take risks most executives wouldn't dare touch. Cox had already proven she was willing to make unpopular moves, like letting Tammy Bentley go in the expansion draft, but that was just the beginning. The bigger gamble was yet to come. It centered around the idea of identity. In sports, identity is everything. It's what separates a team that's remembered for a moment from a team that defines an era. Cox wasn't content with Indiana being remembered as the scrappy underdogs of 2025. She wanted them to be remembered as the team that forced the WNBA to evolve. That meant thinking beyond the court. The Fever's practices became showcases of intensity, with Cox herself often watching from the sidelines, making mental notes about who responded to pressure and who shrank from it. Training sessions were designed to mimic high-stakes environments, conditioning players to thrive under stress. Even in team meetings, Cox would throw curveballs, unexpected challenges meant to test how players adapted when their comfort zones were ripped away. Every moment was calculated to build resilience. Because Cox knew that when the playoffs came, or when the league's spotlight burned the brightest, resilience would be the difference between fading away and rising to the occasion. But resilience alone wasn't enough. The Fever also needed vision on the floor, leaders who could embody the culture Cox was building and spread it among teammates. This is where her eye for talent came into play. Analysts often judged players by stats alone, but Cox looked deeper. She studied body language, off-ball effort, communication during huddles. She valued grit, but she also valued basketball IQ, the ability to see the game, not just play by play, but as a grand design. That's why when she brought in overlooked players, many scratched their heads at first. But those players soon revealed themselves as puzzle pieces fitting into a larger picture. Indiana's bench wasn't just depth, it was a second wave of energy that often overwhelmed opponents late in games. Players other teams had dismissed became linchpins in Cox's system. And every breakout performance fed into her long-term narrative. Indiana Fever basketball was no longer about star power. It was about culture power. Yet even as she preached culture, Cox understood the undeniable truth. Sports fans crave stars. Every great franchise needs a face, a player whose jersey sells out, whose highlights dominate social media, whose presence puts butts in seats. For Indiana, that figure was starting to take shape. Cox never said it publicly, but her moves pointed toward grooming one player to be that franchise cornerstone. She surrounded them with support, gave them opportunities to shine, and let them fail without fear of being abandoned. It was a high-wire act. Push too hard and you risk burning out the player, protect too much and you risk stunting their growth. But Cox seemed to know exactly how much weight to put on their shoulders. Fans could feel it too. Chants in arenas grew louder, rival teams began keying in defensively, and media outlets circled like sharks, waiting to anoint the next superstar. Cox didn't resist the hype. She orchestrated it, allowing it to build naturally, feeding it just enough without letting it spiral out of control. Meanwhile, behind the curtain, she was already plotting phase 2. The Fever's rise wasn't just about one season or one playoff run. It was about positioning Indiana as a destination. A team where free agents wanted to play, where young prospects dreamed of being drafted, where the culture was strong enough to outlast any single player or coach. Cox understood that stars come and go, but culture endures. If she could lock in a culture of grit, belief, and relentless identity, then Indiana could weather any storm. The question wasn't if this plan would take years to fully pay off. It was whether she'd be given the time. Ownership in sports is rarely patient. A few bad months, a losing streak, and the calls for change can come quickly. But Cox had built enough early momentum, enough buzz, that ownership seemed willing to trust her vision. For now, at least. And that for now is what keeps the entire project so fascinating. Because as much as Cox has orchestrated Indiana's transformation, the WNBA is unpredictable. Rival executives are already taking notes, figuring out ways to counter her strategy. Some teams will try to copy it, others will try to dismantle it by targeting Indiana's rising stars. The league doesn't stand still, and Cox knows it. That's why every move she makes feels like it's layered with intention. Nothing is wasted. Nothing is random. Every trade, every draft pick, every press conference comment is part of a larger design. But here's the truth that makes this story so compelling. For all the planning, all the foresight, sports are still played on the court. And on the court, chaos always finds a way in. Injuries, slumps, officiating controversies, rivalries boiling over. These are the things no executive can fully control. And yet, that's exactly what makes Cox's gamble so bold. She isn't just betting on her roster. She's betting that her culture will withstand the chaos. That when adversity hits, and it always does, the Fever won't crumble. They'll rise. And if she's right, then we're witnessing the birth of something bigger than a season turnaround. We're witnessing the foundation of a dynasty. A dynasty not built on the flashiest names or the biggest contracts, but on the unshakable belief that identity wins. And maybe, just maybe, Amber Cox is about to prove that the Indiana Fever, once overlooked and underestimated, are now the blueprint for the future of the WNBA.